there is a story in Italian motorsport that nobody talks about enough. In the 1920s, Alfa Romeo had a young racing driver on its payroll. Not a great driver, but an exceptional organiser. A man who understood racing machinery the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Alfa Romeo eventually let him go. That man built his own cars, put his own name on them, and spent the next 5 decades making Alfa Romeo look ordinary by comparison. His name was Enzo Ferrari, and the fact that Alfa Romeo trained its own greatest rival, then spent a century struggling to keep up with it, tells you almost everything you need to know about this brand. Today, Ferrari's market capitalization sits at approximately $63 billion. Stellantis, the conglomerate that currently owns Alfa Romeo and 13 other brands, is worth around $20 billion. The company that Alfa Romeo trained is now worth 3 times the company that owns Alfa Romeo. That is not a coincidence. That is a lesson. And by the time you finish watching this video, you will understand exactly why this happened, and why the same psychological trap that destroyed Alfa Romeo is probably operating somewhere in your own life right now. This is not a story about a company that failed because it lacked vision. It is a story about a company that had more vision than almost anyone in the automotive world, and kept finding new ways to waste it. In the 1920s, Alfa Romeo was not a car company in the modern sense. It was a weapon. The P2 won the inaugural World Grand Prix Championship in 1925. The 8C dominated Le Mans 4 consecutive times between 1931 and 1934. When you drove an Alfa Romeo in that era, you were not simply buying a vehicle, you were buying a statement about what you believed the world should look like. Speed, precision, elegance. The badge with the serpent and the red cross did not represent a product. It represented a philosophy. The Milanese factory at Betrayal produced cars that engineers at Mercedes-Benz and Bugatti studied with barely concealed envy. Vittorio Giorgio, the chief designer, created an engine architecture so advanced that its core principles shaped European performance engineering for decades. Racing wins translated directly into showroom prestige. The factory was not just building cars, it was building a mythology. And mythologies are powerful things. They attract believers. They generate loyalty that borders on irrational. The problem is that mythologies do not pay invoices. By the early 1930s, Alfa Romeo had raced itself into serious financial trouble. The costs of competition were extraordinary, the returns inconsistent, and the company had flirted with bankruptcy at least twice before the Italian government stepped in. What happened next was the first act of a tragedy that would take 100 years to fully play out, and the entity that stepped in to save Alfa Romeo was about to become the single, most destructive force in its history. Not because it wanted to destroy something beautiful, but it had absolutely no interest in whether Alfa Romeo survived as a car company at all. In 1933, ownership of Alfa Romeo passed to the Italian state through a holding company called IRI. On paper, this looked like a rescue. In practice, it was a textbook demonstration of what economists call the principal-agent problem. Here is how it works. In any organization, you have principals, the people who own something and set the goals, and you have agents, the people hired to pursue those goals. The system functions when both groups want the same thing. It collapses when they don't. The Italian state, as the new principal, did not need Alfa Romeo to make profits. It needed Alfa Romeo to make jobs, make headlines, and make the ruling class look competent. Those are 3 very different objectives. The engineers, the actual agents responsible for building the cars, wanted to manufacture performance. They wanted to win races, push boundaries, and build things that changed what people believed a machine could be. These 2 sets of motivations were not just different. They were structurally incompatible. And incompatible incentives, left unresolved, always produce the same outcome. The agent learns to serve the principal's stated goals rather than the actual mission, and the actual mission dies quietly, without anyone specifically choosing to kill it. For a while, the contradictions were manageable. The Giulietta sold over 200,000 units by the mid-1960s. The post-war economic boom gave the brand genuine room to grow. But underneath the success, the government was making decisions that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with votes. The mandate was simple. Make a mass-market car, build a factory in the south, keep the workers happy, keep the politicians happier. Nobody asked whether this strategy made business sense, because nobody in a position of power particularly cared whether it did. The engineers, the people who actually understood what Alfa Romeo was supposed to be, were increasingly the last people consulted. Even inside a failing system, genius finds a way out. In the 1960s, Alfa Romeo produced two of the most beautiful automobiles the world had ever seen. The Giulia Sprint, styled by Giorgio, was a masterpiece of restrained aggression. The Spider, designed by Pininfarina and made forever famous by a young Dustin Hoffman in a red convertible on a California freeway, was pure cinema. These were cars that made grown adults stop walking and stare. The driving experience matched the aesthetics. The Giulia's twin-cam engine produced sounds that no engineer had planned and no accountant could quantify. The chassis communicated road texture the way a piano key communicates a note. Alfa Romeo in the 1960s was doing what Ferrari did, at a price normal people could reach. But behind the beauty, the books were a disaster. The optimism of the 1960s had led Alfa Romeo to embark on an overambitious expansion plan for the 1970s. Racing still consumed enormous resources. The government kept demanding employment guarantees that made cost-cutting impossible, and just over the horizon, a political decision was being finalised that would do more damage to this brand than any competitor ever could. The engineers had momentum. They had the Giulia, the Spider, and buyers who genuinely loved what they were building. And somewhere in Rome, a committee of men who had never driven anything faster than a Fiat 500 were about to decide Alfa Romeo's next decade. They were going to build a factory, but not in Milan, where Alfa knew how to build cars. Somewhere they had never built cars before, staffed by workers who had never built cars at all, not because it made any business sense, because it would win an election. The Alfasud project was born in the late 1960s, and its origins had almost nothing to do with cars. The Italian government was facing a chronic economic crisis. The industrialised north was booming. The south, the Mezzogiorno, was being left behind. Young southerners were migrating to Milan and Turin, straining urban infrastructure and creating serious political instability. The solution, as far as certain politicians were concerned, was to bring industry south. And Alfa Romeo, as a state-owned company, had no real choice in the matter. A new factory was built at Pomigliano d'Arco outside Naples. The car it would produce was genuinely exceptional on paper. British magazine Autocar praised its ride, grip and handling. The Alfasud was technically sophisticated, beautifully designed by Giugiaro, and priced for the mass market. Nearly 900,000 were eventually sold. What happened next is not a story about incompetence. It is a story about the sunk cost fallacy, one of the most destructive forces in all of human decision-making. By the early 1970s, it was already clear that the Pomigliano factory was a catastrophe. Absenteeism ran at 16.5% through the decade, spiking as high as 28%. The workforce had no automotive manufacturing background. Union militancy made quality control almost impossible to enforce. Unfinished body shells sat exposed to coastal weather. Rust attacked structural components sometimes within just a few years. The state had to cover around a quarter of worker salaries through unemployment agencies just to keep the plant running at 60% capacity. The rational decision, at any point in this process, was to admit the experiment had failed and change course. But rational decisions require rational incentives. The Italian government had invested enormous political capital in the promise of southern industrialization. Admitting that Pomigliano was a mistake meant admitting that the promise was a lie. And so they did what every organisation does when facing the sunk cost fallacy. They doubled down. They kept pumping money into a structure that could not work because the alternative was accepting that the money already spent was gone forever. That psychological trap is not unique to Italian bureaucrats. It operates in every failed marriage, every failed startup, and every company that keeps a product on the market long after the market has moved on. Intelligent people, faced with mounting evidence of failure, choose escalation over exit because exit means admitting they were wrong. And the human brain treats being wrong as an existential threat rather than information. The Alfasud never turned a profit, not once. Alfa Romeo learned the hard way what happens when you build a company around political metrics instead of commercial ones. You lose the politics anyway, and you destroy the product doing it. Drop a comment below if you have ever watched a company or someone you know keep pouring resources into something that stopped working, simply because stopping felt like losing. The jokes started slowly, then they became a flood. In 1979, a British motoring journalist drove an Alfasud from London to Turin for a magazine piece. He never made it past Lyon. A structural sill had rusted through. He called the breakdown service, waited 4 hours in the rain, and wrote one line in his review. The engineers built a masterpiece. Someone else built the car. That single sentence spread across every motoring publication in Europe, and it landed because everyone who had tried to own an Alfasud already knew it was true. By the late 1970s, Alfa Romeo had become the punchline of a continental conversation about Italian industrial decline. The phrase that circulated among mechanics across Britain and Germany was blunt: beautiful to drive, impossible to own. Electrical gremlins plagued the entire lineup. Switches failed, instruments misbehaved. Owners reported that a dry Italian summer was their car's best friend, because rain seemed to trigger a cascade of small failures. Consumer trust, once lost, rarely comes back cleanly. The reputation collapse happened the way all reputations collapse. Slowly, then all at once. And by the early 1980s, the company that had trained Enzo Ferrari, that had won world championships, was a brand that sophisticated European buyers actively avoided. Just when the company needed visionary leadership most urgently, the government decided to sell it. Two bidders emerged. One had a credible plan and the distribution network to save the brand. The other had a very different agenda entirely. In the spring of 1986, Ford and Alfa Romeo were in serious negotiations. Ford's plan was credible. They proposed acquiring a 20% stake, with a binding option to build toward majority control over the following 8 years. They committed to an investment plan costing the equivalent of approximately $2.4 billion. They planned to return Alfa to profitability by 1990. Most critically, with access to Ford's dealer network, Alfa Romeo would never have left the American market. IRA President Romano Prodi was enthusiastic. His own consultants, having reviewed both bids, indicated the Ford offer represented serious long-term value. By September 1986, Ford's offer was formalized. Then Gianni Agnelli made his move. Fiat presented its offer for the complete and immediate takeover of Alfa Romeo in October 1986. The terms were engineered to look more attractive than they were. Fiat would pay in 5 installments starting in 1993 and would only accept liability for around 70% of Alfa's considerable debt. The Italian government would remain on the hook for the rest. The European Commission later investigated whether the terms had effectively subsidized Fiat at Ferrari's own expense. That investigation concluded in 1989. The deal, stripped of its political theatre, was financially inferior to Ford's offer, and yet the Italian government chose Fiat, partly because of national pride, partly because Agnelli's family was woven into the fabric of Italian political power, in ways that Ford's executives were not. Alfa Romeo ceased to exist as a corporate entity on the 1st of January 1987. The decision cost Italy a competing automotive manufacturer. Today, as Italy's current Minister of Enterprise has publicly stated, Italy has one car company, whereas France, Germany and Poland each have 3, 4 or 5. The price of that choice was 40 years of market consolidation that nobody voted for. Fiat immediately merged Alfa with Lancia and began sharing platforms. The rear-wheel drive architecture that had defined Alfa's character was largely abandoned. The soul of Alfa Romeo did not leave all at once. It was left in increments, one compromise at a time. The 1990s and 2000s were the wilderness years. Alfa Romeo still made beautiful cars. The 156, launched in 1997, won European Car of the Year. In its peak year, 1998, it sold just over 98,000 units across Europe. Journalists called it transformative. They were right about the car. Nobody was right about the business. That same year, BMW sold approximately 400,000 3 Series worldwide. The 156 at its absolute peak barely reached a quarter of that figure, and only in European markets, because Alfa had abandoned the United States entirely in 1995 and would not return for 20 years. The 156 enjoyed success that the marque hadn't experienced since the 1960s, but the 156 was built on a Fiat platform, tuned by engineers who were fighting for a budget that Fiat kept redirecting toward other priorities. When reliability problems emerged at scale, the dealer network was too thin and too underfunded to contain them. Large corporate leasing companies in Germany began removing the 156 from their approved lists. BMW reacted to the initial threat from the 156 by pressuring leasing partners. They needn't have bothered for long. Alfa's own dealer network did the damage for them. The brand existed in a permanent no man's land, too expensive to compete on price with mainstream manufacturers, too compromised to compete on prestige with BMW, Mercedes and Audi. Alfa Romeo's salespeople were essentially asking customers to pay a premium for passion, which is a very difficult conversation to have when the windscreen wipers on the car in front of you are shared with a Fiat Stilo. By the time the 156's successor arrived in 2005, the moment had passed. The 159 was a fine car. It sold 65,000 units in its best year. The 156 at its peak had sold nearly 100,000. The window had closed. In 2015, something extraordinary happened. Sergio Marchionne, one of the most aggressive chief executives in the history of the automotive industry, decided Alfa Romeo deserved a genuine second chance. He commissioned a bespoke rear-wheel drive platform, the Giorgio, and put the best engineers at Fiat Chrysler to work on it. The result was the Giulia. The Giulia Quadrifoglio lapped the Nürburgring faster than a BMW M3. Not roughly, not almost. Faster. Full stop. The Stelvio was the SUV that Porsche's Macan should have been afraid of. These were not compromise cars. They were the real thing, and they proved conclusively that the engineers who carried the Alfa Romeo name still knew exactly what they were doing. But everything surrounding those cars was still broken. The dealership network in America was thin, undertrained, and staffed by people whose primary experience was selling Jeeps and Rams. Service wait times were appalling. The brand perception shaped by 20 years of neglect and 2 decades of American absence did not recover, because a single generation of great cars arrived. Sales of the Giulia and Stelvio peaked briefly and then declined. Alfa Romeo reported a 29% drop in year-over-year American sales in 2024. Masterpieces, sitting in showrooms that nobody trusted enough to visit. Marchionne died in 2018. The vision died with him, which brings us to today, and today is not a comfortable place for Alfa Romeo. In 2025, Alfa Romeo suffered the most savage decline in the entire Stellantis American lineup. Shipments dropped 36% to just 5,652 vehicles. The Giulia and Stelvio, the cars that beat a BMW M3, fell by 41%. Stellantis posted a loss of €22.3 billion in 2025. The company has identified 4 core brands as the focus for its future investment: Peugeot, Jeep, Ram, and Fiat. Alfa Romeo was not mentioned. The original plan to go fully electric by 2027 has been abandoned. A larger crossover might arrive in 2028, or it might not. Nobody seems entirely certain. And here is the number that should haunt everyone watching this. Ferrari's market capitalization today sits at approximately $63 billion. Stellantis, which owns Alfa Romeo and 13 other brands, sits at around $20 billion. The company that Enzo Ferrari built after Alfa Romeo let him go is now worth 3 times the company that let him go. He did not have better cars than Alfa Romeo in 1939. He had a clearer mission. He had alignment between what his company was supposed to do and what the people running it actually wanted. That alignment between principal and agent, between owner and operator, between stated goal and actual incentive is the only thing that separates a legend from a cautionary tale. Alfa Romeo's engineers were never the problem. The cars were almost always extraordinary. The problem was a century of decisions made by people who did not care whether Alfa Romeo thrived as a car company, as long as it served their other purposes: government interference, corporate absorption, neglected markets, broken promises. Each generation inherited the damage of the previous one and added its own layer. The question for 2026 is not whether Alfa Romeo can build a great car. We already know it can. The question is whether the people who currently own it have the patience and the conviction to build the ecosystem around those cars that turns passion into profit. Enzo Ferrari left Alfa Romeo in 1939. He spent the next 8 decades making them look ordinary. The man they let go built the thing they could never become. And based on the evidence of 100 years, I would not bet against history repeating itself.